From the I24NEWS studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Shuster and Tal Heinrich.
There's been a deadly mass shooting this evening in France. Police say a gunman opened fire at a Christmas market in the city of Strasbourg.
Authorities say the shooter killed 4 people and injured at least 12 others. Police are reportedly searching for the suspect, who they say is wounded. We'll have more on that story later in the broadcast.
But now to the growing Cold War-like tensions between the United States and Russia. 2 Russian bombers have now been deployed thousands of miles away to Venezuela. The
Tu-160 supersonic jets are nuclear capable. The Kremlin has not said whether or not the jets are armed. Venezuelan officials said it was all part of planned military exercises.
Nobody in the world should be afraid by the presence of these airplanes. Logistic bombers hunting strategic bombers that came into Venezuelan territory.
For more, let's bring in senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson in Washington. Nina, what about the timing of this deployment? Why would Russia send this kind of plane to Venezuela now?
Well, Tal, the timing's no coincidence at all. It's just a few days ago that President Putin was hosting his Venezuelan counterpart in Moscow. They are traditional allies. They have a very, very close military understanding, clearly. And also, Russia has just plowed $6 billion into Venezuela's struggling economy. So this is a clear signal, not just to Venezuela that we support you. It's also a clear signal to the United States.
These planes are special, though, right? I mean, they're not carrying foodstuffs or humanitarian aid.
Not at all, David. Also, what we're seeing here is a sort of showcase of Russian military technology. These planes are absolutely state-of-the-art. They're supersonic. They can travel for over 7,000 miles without refueling. And they're capable, as you said, of carrying nuclear missiles. So, again, what we're seeing is a show of force by Russia and a stark warning to the United States that they can fly very quickly and smoothly into this hemisphere.
How has the United States reacted?
Well, as you can imagine, Tal, we've had a tweet from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He is saying that these are, and I'm quoting here, 2 corrupt governments, that they are basically squandering their people's money and they're placing restrictions on their own people. So Mike Pompeo not impressed. The Pentagon used similar language at their briefing earlier today. And as for the Kremlin, they're saying this reaction is very undiplomatic.
Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent, reporting from Washington. And Nina, thank you. For more on Russia's military deployment to Venezuela, let's bring in former U.S. intelligence officer Donald Bramer. He's the founder and chairman of the Bramer Group. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And Don, what do the Venezuelans get by having 2 Russian nuclear-capable bombers deployed to Venezuela?
Well, David, what Venezuela receives here is a guarantee that that $6 billion that Nina spoke of will go into their coffers. You know, Nicolas Maduro has pretty much squandered all of Venezuela's treasures, and this is what socialism is not working for the country. You have a failing economy, a failing water grid, a failing power grid, and people starving in the streets while they're trying to play military war games in a country that just needs to feed its own people.
So that's what the Venezuelan government gets out of this. What is the real Russian interest in Venezuela, though?
Well, the Russians' interest here is they're trying to make a power play. They're trying to let President Trump know that they do have a sphere of influence in our hemisphere. You know, if you look at this, this is very similar to what we saw in 1962 when, not far off the United States, 106 miles, for 13 days, this country stood still with a very similar leader with Nikolai Khrushchev.
Right, and in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a guarantee by the United States, by the Kennedy administration, that there would not be a coup against Fidel Castro. Has there been much discussion or consideration by the United States of a coup to try to topple Maduro in Venezuela?
Well, that's all going to depend on who you talk to. Maduro has been claiming for 2 years now that the United States, other Latin countries, and even members of the EU are trying to topple his government. Obviously, you know, his election is as big a sham as what you see in a Russian election, and this has been an ongoing conversation back and forth with a elected official who is not being recognized by the global community.
What has been the Trump administration's strategy so far in addressing the crisis in Venezuela? How would you define it?
Well, like many strategies we've seen, there's been a lot of rhetoric back and forth. I'm sure that the Pentagon has a clear, defined role that we do. Trump himself has threatened that we would send in military forces to Venezuela if need be, but other than rhetoric, that's all we've seen come out of that.
And so as a result, there are the Russians making a big deal, making sure the cameras are there in Venezuela for the arrival of these bombers. How do you imagine this goes over? I mean, we saw the comments publicly, of course, by Secretary of State Pompeo. He said that the Russians and the Venezuelans are corrupt. But what do you imagine is the conversation going on behind closed doors within the Trump administration about this?
Well, I'm hoping that both governments continue to have an open dialogue. I think that Vladimir Putin feels a bit shunned after the president canceled his meeting just a few weeks ago at the summit. I think that's probably what part of this has to do as a show of force that Vladimir wants to continue to be recognized. But you have two very strong personalities here going against each other head for head. And a gentleman down in Venezuela who believes that he's trying to find a bedfellow who will align him, support his economy, and give him anything that he can do to support. You know, many of the loans that the Russians have given Venezuela, they've not been able to even pay.
So if Russia is increasing its intervention in Venezuela, should we assume that the United States sooner or later in some sort of a Cold War move will act more?
Well, for many people, they've said the Cold War has been over for a long time. I think what we're seeing here is a continued resurgence of the Cold War, and it's going to take a serious conversation between these two world leaders to see where we move forward and how not only with, as we look at Venezuela, but issues ongoing with China, North Korea, and Iran as well.
Donald Bramer, he is the founder and chairman of the Bramer Group from Washington. And Don, thanks for doing this. Tal, what do you make of the Russians' move here by putting these? I mean, obviously, they wanted it to be an unmistakable message to the United States about these nuclear bombers and the connection between Russia and Venezuela. But what are the Russians really after here, in your estimation?
I mean, it's just the same old story again. It's this part of the world where Russia has no foothold, and I think they want to increase their influence, and they see an open door with Nicolas Maduro. He is in need of some kind of support. The United States, he's saying, is trying to oust him, and Russia bursts into this open door.
But it makes me wonder, I mean, I suppose look, if Russia wants to have a show of force and to say, look, the United States should not even dare militarily to do anything with Venezuela, that's fine. The message has been clear. But you'd think that the Russians would also make a big show of, I don't know, delivering humanitarian
something
aid,
to the people.
or doing something to help the Venezuelan people to say, hey, we're with you, and not just militarily.
I mean, they would say that the $6 billion, it's $6 billion, right? $6 billion is also by part going to help the population there, although it's not really. We know you give money to the government there and it stays within the government. Nothing is trickling into the people. We talk so much these days, David, about immigration. I think that one of the most overlooked aspects when we talk about Venezuela is the fact that it's one of the biggest immigration crises in the world. Over 3 million people, 1 million people immigrated from Venezuela to Colombia. It's something that we don't really mention.
Yeah, and all the countries in the region are very worried about it, and now they've gotten the message that the Venezuelan government, at least according to the Russians, they're not going anywhere. Just ahead, the alleged Hezbollah terror tunnels in the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu says that Hezbollah has dug a third tunnel into Israel, and that Netanyahu and the Israelis are pledging a response.
Plus, they say the enemy of your enemy is your friend, while worries about Iran may be bringing Israel closer to other historic Arab rivals. Welcome back. You're watching Crossroads. In the West Bank, the Israeli military stopped twin car ramming attacks.
The separate attacks are part of a recent uptick in West Bank terror, including a drive-by shooting last Sunday. I24NEWS diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim has the latest.
A pair of terror attacks in the West Bank on Tuesday morning, increasing fears in the IDF of an upsurge in Palestinian violence in the region. Here near Hebron, a 27-year-old assailant shot dead by border police officers as he attempted to ram their vehicles. Those officers were providing guard for Defense Ministry civil administration workers who were carrying out an operation in the area. Meanwhile, another ramming attempt in the northern Jordan Valley. That suspect was arrested arrested after border police shot warnings into the air. There were only 7 recorded terror attacks in the West Bank in the first half of 2018, but already 12 now since September. The IDF worried that Hamas is leading these attacks and gaining a foothold in the area. Meanwhile, the suspects from Sunday's Ofra terror attack, in which 7 Israelis were shot, are still on the loose. Not only that, the terrorist from the Barkan Industrial Park from 2 months ago, still on the loose as well, providing additional incentives for Palestinian terrorists to carry out their attacks. Reporting from Hebron in the West Bank, Mike Wagenheim, I24 News.
The IDF also announced another terror tunnel dug into Israel from Lebanon. This is the 3rd Hezbollah tunnel confirmed by the Israeli military.
A UN agency and the Israeli military are working to destroy these tunnels. Prime Minister Netanyahu is promising to strike back over the revelations of these efforts.
We just exposed the 3rd tunnel. We are systematically dismantling the tunnel weapons. But the most impressive thing is the deployment present here, in spirit and in substance. Our deployment is ready for a strong response if Hezbollah make a big mistake and decide to harm us or to resist to the operation we are conducting. Hezbollah will be hit in such a way that they cannot even imagine.
To discuss, let's bring in Dr. Asaf Romirovsky, fellow at the Middle East Forum. Asaf, a week of intense violence and unrest in the West Bank. Some people in Israel think that, by part, the reason behind this unrest is $15 million that were transferred from Qatar into Gaza, delivered to Hamas, and that gives Hamas free money to invest in stirring unrest in the West Bank. Do you think that could be part of the reason?
For sure, it's part of the reason. It's always about the economic incentive. But beyond that, I mean, you're seeing also a pressure from the north vis-a-vis Hezbollah, and you're seeing pressure from the south vis-a-vis Hamas. That's always been the concern on the Israeli part as far as coordination between these two groups coming together with the idea of trying to pressure Israel to act. Now, you're also seeing similarities vis-a-vis the terror tunnels, as we saw in the southern part of Israel. Now you're seeing in the northern part of Israel. There's no doubt that Hezbollah already had the economic incentive vis-a-vis the Iranian deal, not to mention the support they're getting from Iran at large, and of course Hezbollah basically taking over all of Lebanon. So that has not been a factor for the northern part of Israel. For the southern part of Israel, the concern has been, of course, Hamas has had the money, and of course we've seen over the past months these ongoing protest against the Israeli border, with the idea of Israel trying to push Israel into a conflict with Hamas. And of course, we saw the resignation of Lieberman as a result of the Israelis' non-actions, though we are seeing the opposite response now when it comes to Lebanon vis-a-vis a state actor versus a non-state actor that you're seeing in the southern part of Israel as it relates to Hamas.
Dr. Romirovsky, as you pointed out, I mean, the tensions with Hezbollah between Israel along the Syrian and Lebanese border, they've existed for some time. Why do you think that the Israeli government is making such a big deal now of these terror tunnels? Is it possible that they are laying the groundwork, at least publicly, in terms of PR, for some sort of incursion into Lebanon?
For sure. I mean, I think that this has been going on for quite some time. The concern has been for several months now that all the conflict and the problems in Syria would spill into Israel. Israel has been playing a diplomatic game with the Russians as far as trying to keep giving them enough information that would prevent them, or at least try to prevent the Russians from letting Hezbollah, spill into Israel. Now you're seeing that there's a lot more violence in that area ever since Hezbollah took over the Lebanese parliament. So between the factor of Lebanon and Syria playing into each other and the fact that Hezbollah controls the entire area, not to mention the fact that you have the Iranian Guard, you have money coming in out of Iran, there's no doubt that, and if you look at all the comments that have been coming officially out of Hezbollah, Hezbollah has been ready for an attack a la 2006, or in order, only 10 times, 100 times more than what they did in 2006 as far as weaponry and as far as money coming in. To that end, the Israelis are ready to deal with that reality. We've seen over the past few years Israel going into making strikes from the air as far as strategic targets in those areas, but I do believe that there is definitely a concern with the growth of terror tunnels that we may be seeing some ground preparation and ground incursions as a result of the growth of these areas. And that's something to be concerned about as a result of what we know from the past, and the concern, of course, as the northern communities that have been impacted as a result of what happened in 06 vis-a-vis Kiryat Shmona, Metula, and those areas. We're not seeing that same concern, and I think that's where the public outcry has been vis-a-vis the southern part of Israel.
Dr. Asaf Romorowski from the Middle East Forum. Dr. Romorowski, thanks for joining us. Australia says that it will recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Australia's president promised to Prime Minister Netanyahu back in October that he would make this move, and Australian cabinet officials are now expected to formally ratify the decision after it is formally approved by Australia's National Security Committee.
The decision will be announced on Wednesday. Australia is not expected, though, to open a new embassy in Jerusalem. Instead, they are expected to create a new consular office in Jerusalem.
Now to our part 2 of a very special series on the warming ties between Israel and historic rivals in the Arab Gulf states.
The growing relations may be due to a common foe of Israel and many Arab states, Iran. I24 News senior Middle East correspondent Mohammed Al-Qasim has more.
Gulf countries and Israel accuse Tehran of meddling in internal affairs of regional countries like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Bahrain, and in the Palestinian Gaza Strip.
The Iranian regime has kept its aggressive policies of intervening in the internal affairs of other countries. This requires all of us to maintain our country's gains and to work with our partners to preserve security and stability in the region.
And a new partner for Riyadh may be sitting in Jerusalem. Iran's military presence in neighboring Syria worries Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused Tehran of supporting groups like the Palestinian Hamas and the Lebanese Hezbollah in their threat to Israel's existence.
These cross-border terror tunnels were built by Hezbollah with direct support and funding from Iran.
Both Saudi Arabia and Israel are wary of Iran's nuclear ambitions and of its ballistic missile program. They say Tehran's policy in the region is proof that it has an expansionist plan, and its aim is to destabilize the region. Although security interests may be aligning Israel and the Gulf states, some believe it's far from a long-term strategic partnership.
There's no doubt that there's a tactical component to it. For it to be strategic, it is important that stability in the Gulf is restored and that a sense of collective security emerges. And there cannot be any security in the Gulf as long as the Gulf states compete with one another, and as long as external actors are being dragged into the Gulf, whether it is Iran, Turkey, or even Russia.
For its part, Israel is willing to provide advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states in return for normalizing ties. U.S. President Donald Trump made no secret that he wants a new alliance in the Middle East to contain Iran's growing influence. In the past, the Palestinian issue has kept the Gulf states from any public contact with Israel. But with Iran being a common threat to Israel and the Gulf, this may prove the old geopolitical adage, that's my enemy's enemy is my friend. Mohammed Al-Qasim, I24 News.
Staying in the Middle East, war monitors are sounding the alarm again over the Saudi Arabian-led offensive in Yemen. A new report says that in November, just over 3,000 civilians in the conflict were killed.
The report says the war has killed over 28,000 people so far this year. The group also estimates a total of 60,223 people killed since. That number is over 6 times higher than the United Nations estimates. Now to discuss, let's bring in Alon Ben-Meir. He's a professor and senior fellow at the NYU Center for Global Affairs and senior fellow at the World Policy Institute. Alon, despite these numbers, I want to start with the good news on Yemen. Peace talks, sort of peace talks, I think we can say, more like a truce over the port of Hodeidah talks are taking place in Sweden now. The Houthis are there, the government representatives are there. What can we make of this?
I don't think much is going to come out of this. If they agree on a prisoner exchange, that's good, provided with that there must be also an agreement, immediate cessation of hostilities immediately. You know, this has been going on for now 4 years. And sadly, tragically, the United States has been part and parcel of the Saudis' basically war crimes against innocent civilians in Yemen. And that's got to have to be stopped. So what we are witnessing today, and you mentioned the number of dead, nearly 60,000. Other estimates go as far as 100,000. But more than that, 5 million Yemenites are on the verge of starvation. Every single day, nearly 85 children died from starvation. So it is a tragedy, and the whole world is watching it silently, and that is simply unacceptable. And for us, the United States, to be part and parcel of that slaughter is totally and completely unacceptable.
The pictures are hard to watch, whether it's the video or some of the photographs that you've brought of the starving children and all the people who face a famine in Yemen. Are these images, do you think, getting through to the Saudis and getting through to the Houthi rebels?
I don't think so. Let me show you this. I just want your audience to see. Multiply that by thousands. That is what's taking place today in Yemen. Look at this photo.
These
Again,
are really so.
Look at this.
Really sad.
You know, can you imagine watching tens of thousands in this kind of condition? That's what's happening. And you know, the Arabs have the cultural tradition of burying their dead immediately. They are not able to dig enough graves on time to bury their dead. What we are watching is a major tragedy unfolding in front of our eyes, and we are doing practically nothing to stop it.
You know, Secretary Pompeo, he says to that the situation in Yemen would have been much worse if it wasn't for the United States' support for the Saudi-led coalition. What would you say to that?
I totally and completely disagree with him. Well, how is it could be worse? We are supplying the Yemenite with weapons, munition, and other military equipment to continue their slaughter of the Yemenite people. Moreover, they're also preventing the supply of food to go to the Yemenite people who are starving to death. I just want you to know again, 20 million Yemenites out of the 28 have significant food insecurity, and 5 million, as I said before, are starving actually today. So this is something, it's more than urgent. We need to do something about it immediately. Otherwise, you know, we, the United States, should be standing for something like this, and in fact, not only not doing anything about it, but actually supporting the Saudi effort in this regard.
We're going to leave it there. Alon Badmir, thank you very much. More ahead on Crossroads after this. The coming power dynamic in Washington, D.C. took center stage in the Oval Office on this day. President Trump met with Democratic leaders at the White House to talk about some ways that they might avoid a government shutdown.
But the showdown played out in front of cameras. Correspondent Stephanie Ramos reports from Washington.
And doesn't solve the problem.
In a dramatic Oval Office confrontation,
this has spiraled downward.
Democratic leaders Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, together with the president, clashed big time over border wall funding.
We may not have an agreement today. We probably won't. But we have an agreement on other things that are really good.
With a December 21st deadline to avoid a government shutdown, the clock is ticking. The president wants at least $5 billion for the wall. Democrats are offering $1.3 billion as part of the overall funding package.
The fact is, we do not have the votes in the House.
Nancy, I do. And we need border security. Nancy, we need border security.
Democrats saying they want to work off of the same set of facts.
The Washington Post today gave you a whole lot of Pinocchios because they say you constantly misstate how much the wall is built, how much of the wall is built.
We didn't want to contradict the president when he was putting forth figures that had no reality to them, no basis in fact.
Pelosi says the government is not worth shutting down over a border wall fight, but President Trump isn't budging.
I am proud to shut down the government for border security.
That was a one-of-a-kind meeting, to have the president and the Democratic leaders negotiating out there in the open, and the president to make that kind of concession. He has given a whole lot of negotiating advantage away to the Democrats and made the possibility of a government shutdown much more likely.
And that was Stephanie Ramos reporting.
Let's bring in senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv. Dan, what are people in the world of politics saying about that discussion in the Oval Office?
They couldn't remember seeing anything quite like it, Tal, on live TV. All that was scheduled was a photo opportunity, a photo op where maybe there'd be a few remarks by the president as host for this meeting. It turned into a debate on live TV. And to give you more of a flavor, just consider that the main topic, as you and David were reporting, was how to keep the government open with spending authority expiring on December 21st. And so here's the president and Senator Chuck Schumer, the top Democrat in the Senate. Let's watch.
I think we can agree on is we shouldn't shut down the government over a dispute. And you want to shut it down. You keep talking about it.
The last time, Chuck, you shut it down.
No.
And then you opened it up very quickly. And
20 times.
I don't want to do what you did.
20 times you have called for, I will shut down the government if I don't get my wool. None of us have said.
You want to know something?
You've said it.
Okay, you want to put that on my...
You said it.
I'll take it.
Okay, good.
You know what I'll say? Yes. If we don't get what we want, one way or the other, whether it's through you, through a military, through anything you want to call, I will shut down the government.
Okay,
absolutely. And I am proud, and I'll tell you what,
disagree.
I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck.
Truly like two men from New York arguing. Now, Nancy Pelosi, the top Democrat in the House, she's from California, and that may not be the reason that she was just plain offended. The president using her first name and the way he described her status, about to become once again Speaker of the House. Let's watch.
And I don't think we really disagree so much. I also know that, you know, Nancy's in a situation where it's not easy for her to talk right now, and I understand that, and I fully understand that. We're going to have a good discussion, and we're going to see what happens. But we have to have border security.
Mr. President, please don't characterize the strength that I bring to this meeting as the leader of the House Democrats who just won a big victory. But let me just say,
And that's why the country's doing
this.
so well.
What the president is representing in terms of his cards over there are not factual.
Are there clear winners and losers from all this? Many Republicans are congratulating President Trump for holding his ground. Democrats in general are proud of Pelosi and Schumer, and they feel that Trump has boxed himself in. If there is an unpopular government shutdown just before Christmas, that apparently would be the president's fault. By the way, a little later, the White House and Pelosi both said that the discussions behind closed doors were constructive. Tal and David?
So, Dan, there was Chuck Schumer afterwards saying that President Trump threw a temper tantrum. In the midst of all of this, there are some bipartisan solutions to keep the government running, but those would involve not giving the president the money he wants for his wall?
As far as the Democrats are concerned, we can't be sure what the outcome is. At the end of this week, there will be a 2-week spending extension. No, I'm sorry, that was last week. There was a 2-week spending extension, which did not give the president what he wanted. And the Democrats keep pointing out they're offering him $1.6 billion for Mexican border security. Why doesn't he just take that? We don't know who will end up blinking in this confrontation. David and Tal.
Dan Raviv, thank you.
Well,
David,
what did you make of that?
All right. I heard what Dan Raviv was saying. Democrats saying Pelosi and Schumer won the showdown. Some Republicans saying the president was holding his ground. But my question is, what are the American people sitting at home listening to? What do they care about? A government shutdown? Except for the people who work for the government, I don't think so. They care about their paychecks and Christmas. I think what they're hearing is a president who has a very clear stance. You have to agree, or you can agree or disagree with him on immigration, but he has a very clear stance on immigration and what he wants to do on the border, and he knows how to define it. Chuck Schumer said, we have solutions, we can come to an agreement, but what are your solutions?
I agree with you that the president's very clear that having a wall is very important to him, and he's made that clear over and over again. But here's the problem. Politically, when there is a government shutdown, it is usually the party that is in the White House that pays a price. And when people are not able to get their Social Security checks, or they're not able to get their State Department passports, or they can't go to the Smithsonian Museum, or it's the holidays, they tend to get very mad, and politically that could really hurt Donald Trump and the Republicans. The great irony in all of this is that there does seem to be a bipartisan solution right now, and that is to continue funding the government give the Democrats perhaps some sort of deal on the Dreamers, the children of undocumented immigrants who are here in the United States, and give the president this $1.8 billion in border security, which he could spend as he wants. But
it's not enough for the wall. He's saying he wants more money, and he doesn't seem to want a compromise. But again, he stands his ground, and it's resonating out there with his supporters in a very positive way. It's a campaign promise that he made. You know, we had some guests on this show telling us that the wall is a metaphoric wall, but the president seems to be very, very serious about it still.
I think you make a good point about how it's resonating with his supporters, because one thing that is so different now about this era than so many other areas that many of us in Washington have ever covered, and that is, it used to be the case you would never dare go into the Oval Office of the White House with the president and use non-diplomatic niceties. In other words, even the president would say nice things about the guests who were there, whether it was a foreign dignitary, whether it was members of Congress, and then you might have a knockdown, drag-out argument, but it was away from the cameras. The idea that this spilled out in public in front of the cameras lasted 15 minutes is unheard of, and to your point, I think people have come to expect this, and maybe there's some benefit to at least the transparency of Donald Trump is being very clear about his position, as impolite as this may have been. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are being very clear about their position and their argument that the president isn't speaking in facts. And so this debate, as nasty as it is, and as undiplomatic as it is, at least it's playing out in front of the cameras for the entire American people to see. But there's still some people who I think are regretting and that they are now having to see how the sausage is made, as
if that's what played out in front of the cameras, it only makes us wonder what's going on behind closed doors. And was this a glimpse, a harbinger of things to come starting this January? I mean, it's going to be very interesting, of course, but also very exhausting if that's what's going to happen. I'm just wondering if you saw what Nancy Pelosi said to the cameras, said after this debate. She said that the wall is some sort of a manhood thing for President Trump. She said, as if manhood could ever be associated with him, this wall thing.
I mean, she said it to...
What kind of an argument is that? I mean, if it would have been the other way around, the president would have been, you know...
I mean, to be fair, she said it apparently behind closed doors to her Democratic caucus,
right,
who then immediately went to the reporters and said, guess what Nancy Pelosi just said about Donald Trump's manhood? And there we are, now we're waiting for the Donald Trump tweet to come back at Nancy Pelosi, and everything will be very sort of childlike. But again, it gets to this idea we are in such a different political era where it's bare knuckles fighting, and maybe people like it, maybe they don't, but it's very clear where the divisions are.
And if a wall is the right solution to the border.
Yes. Coming up on Crossroads, a live report from London on the British withdrawal from the European Union, known as Brexit. The two most powerful women in the world, British Prime Minister Theresa May and Germany's Angela Merkel, huddled today, but can they save the deal?
And the slain Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi is honored posthumously as Person of the Year. More next on Crossroads.
We want to give you an update on that deadly shooting in France. It is being investigated as terror-related. A gunman opened fire at a Christmas market in the city of Strasbourg, which is along the border with Germany.
The shooter has killed 4 people and injured at least a dozen others. Authorities are still searching for the suspect, who they say is wounded. I24 News will continue to update that story as we learn more details.
Also in France, the Yellow Vest protests are apparently not going away. Students have now joined the clashes in the streets, and they promise more rioting this weekend.
President Emmanuel Macron's latest concessions have not silenced the movement. Activists are demanding his resignation. I24 News international affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini reports.
Last week, the Yellow Vest protesters kneeled before French police. This week, it was the president who backed down.
The minimum wage will increase by 100 euros a month from 2019, without costing the employer an extra penny.
The Yellow Vest movement has sparked a political crisis for President Emmanuel Macron. What What started as protests against increases in fuel tax has now spread to a nationwide uprising against what's perceived as economic injustice and against Macron himself, earning him the nickname the President of the Rich. The worst riots and most violent protests in decades are part of a leaderless movement with unclear goals. Protesters come from across the political spectrum and social groups.
The measures that Emmanuel Macron announced are from an economic world of the past, and the Yellow Vests want a new world, one that is closer to humanity.
Macron only hopes for one thing, that the cold will come so that everyone will go home, because they can't hold on any longer. But not us. We're going to have a generator, we're going to have heating, we're going to have everything.
I fear that some Yellow Vests will be satisfied with this little crumb. As for me, personally, I will be there again on the Gaillon roundabout tomorrow to protest.
Macron is facing perhaps the biggest test of his presidency, and leaders from both far right and far left are standing ready should he fail.
Macron thought that a distribution of money could calm the citizen insurrection that has broken out.
Once again, I urge the President of the Republic to take into account the suffering that is expressed and to provide an answer.
As the flag bearer for globalism and multiculturalism, President Macron is struggling to be a centrist response to those same pressures that have led to populism and nationalism in other countries. For now, the protests are set to continue. Bianca Zanini, I24 News.
Now to another European country in turmoil. Less than 4 months remain before the UK's divorce from the European Union must be finalized.
With Theresa May's Conservatives unable to secure the votes she needed for the final Brexit push, the UK government is seeking alternatives to move the stalled process forward. I24 News correspondent Asher Westrup-Evans has the latest.
British Prime Minister Theresa May tours Europe in a last-chance bid to save the deal for her country's divorce from the European Union. May met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel to see if her EU counterparts will give the ailing British leader any wiggle room ahead of the March 29, 2019 deadline. The odds look bleak, with the EU steadfast on its negotiating position.
There is no room whatsoever for renegotiation. But, of course, there is room, if used intelligently, is room enough to give further clarification and further interpretations without opening the withdrawal agreement.
May sent shockwaves through the British political establishment after announcing Tuesday a delay in the key Brexit vote in UK Parliament.
Most Prime Ministers lose votes and get things wrong, but yesterday the Prime Minister demeaned her office by unilaterally taking her discredited deal off the table and running away rather than facing the verdict of this House.
Even empowering those making calls for a second Brexit referendum.
Calling on ministers now to begin preparations for a people's vote, including drafting the legislation for the public to be given a final say.
With the British pound falling to a 20-month low as politicians continue to wrangle over details of a deal, businesses are alarmed by Westminster's latest erratic moves.
Unless we get some form of vote between now and Christmas, then the uncertainty is likely to continue. Businesses, above all else, crave certainty. At least businesses knew that there would be a vote on Wednesday. For better or for worse, we would be moving on to the next stage.
With every day that passes, a no deal becomes more likely, with speculation mounting that Europe will face a most disorderly Brexit. Asher Westrup-Evans, I24 News.
For more, let's go to our UK and European correspondent Jonathan Sarchidoti live from London. And so, Jonathan, we heard in that piece that EU leaders are saying they are not going to negotiate, but they will provide clarification and interpretation. Is that enough to help Theresa May?
Almost certainly not enough to help Theresa May, and MPs back in the United Kingdom have been perfectly clear about that, especially those from the DUP. That is the Northern Irish party that Theresa May relies on for her majority in the House of Commons. Their leader, Arlene Foster, has said that no varnishing or tweaking around the edges will be enough, that what they require is the abandonment of the part of the agreement that talks about the backstop. That is the arrangement that could be put in place under the agreement in order to stop there being a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Without that being removed, without that being ditched, the DUP won't be happy. And plenty of others, including Conservative MPs, actually agree with that. The backstop is what this is all about. And Theresa May set off to meet European leaders in order to get clarification on that backstop. But no amount of clarification will be legally binding, and that's what they require.
So May delayed the vote in Parliament yesterday in order to buy more time and try to get more concessions from European Union leaders. But what happens if she goes back to the UK without achieving her goal?
She might be hoping that by going back at a later date and pushing this all right onto the line, she may spook some of the MPs into voting in favour of this deal. She may just think that that high-risk strategy is what will help her tip this over the edge. But that looks incredibly unlikely, and in a sense, she's actually hardening positions against the deal that she wants them to vote for. There is also the rumour at the moment that the required 48 letters that need to be submitted to a backbench committee of the Conservative Party in order to have a vote of no confidence in Theresa May as leader may actually have already been reached. It is still only a rumour, and we had a similar rumour 3 weeks ago, but there are whispers that the vote won't be called until she's back in the country out of courtesy. So Theresa May could potentially be returning to the United Kingdom only to find out that her own leadership is being questioned.
Jonathan Sarchidoti reporting from London. Jonathan, thank you. This has been a violent and frighteningly deadly day in Brazil. A gunman struck a Catholic cathedral in the Brazilian city of Campinas. At least 5 people were killed when the gunman stormed into the house of worship before he took his own life.
Eyewitnesses say the shooter walked in firing 2 guns randomly while people were praying there. The city of 1 million people is just 2 hours north of Sao Paulo.
While Brazil had 64,000 murders last year, experts say random mass shootings in the country are extremely rare. Here in the United States, it has been just 45 days since 11 people were killed during the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre, and now police say they have successfully thwarted plans to attack a synagogue in Toledo, Ohio.
Police arrested 21-year-old Damon Joseph last Friday after he acquired 2 AR-15 rifles. They say he spent months planning an attack in the name of ISIS. Jewish community leaders praised law enforcement. They said they were shocked to hear the plans to attack another synagogue.
Also in Toledo, in a separate incident, police have arrested Elizabeth Lecron for planning a mass murder. This 23-year-old was charged with transporting explosive materials.
The woman caught the attention of federal agents after glorifying mass murderers on social media, like the Columbine shooters and Dylan Roof, who was convicted of murder in the Charleston church shooting.
Justice was swift on this day in Virginia. A jury has found 21-year-old neo-Nazi guilty of murder after he drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters last year in Charlottesville.
The jury is recommending he spend the rest of his life plus 419 years behind bars, and he could still face the death penalty for separate federal charges for alleged hate crimes. Correspondent Maggie Woolley reports.
Whose streets? Our streets. Whose streets? Our streets.
Activists outside the courthouse say today is only the first step after a jury recommends life in prison plus 419 years for James Fields.
Today is such a mix of emotions. This is probably one of those things I'll sit at home and cry tonight because I would have been decorating for Christmas by now.
Fields killed her daughter, 32-year-old Heather Heyer, when he plowed his car into a crowd at a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville last year.
I will always, always, always have a hole in my heart.
And he injured nearly 36 others.
He tried to break us. We are unbreakable. Our bodies are healing and our souls are stronger than ever.
Several of those injured, along with Heather's mother, spoke to the jury yesterday, pointing to images of Fields shared during the trial that show him marching with Vanguard America, a known white supremacist group just moments before that fatal ramming. And while Heather's mom says today is progress, she wants to see the fight continue.
The larger issue is, what do we do with hate in this country? We will not tolerate hate. Hate has severe consequences.
Let's move on. Every year, Time Magazine announces its Person of the Year, and this year's choice is definitely making a statement. I24NEWS correspondent Ariel Hickson has that story.
Journalists who have risked their lives, Some even paid the ultimate sacrifice in pursuit of the truth. And this year, as a group, they are being honored as Time's Person of the Year. The powerful faces stare out of 4 different Time covers. Now journalists are in the spotlight.
This year we've chosen The Guardians and the War Against Truth. We're focusing this year on journalists who have been under the threat of assault, in some cases murdered, arrested, indicted, and faced, in the case of the Capital Gazette, a massacre in their newsroom.
The honorees include Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian journalist murdered and dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. While alone in Chao So-u, Reuters reporters imprisoned by the government of Myanmar for reporting on the killings of the Rohingya Muslims. Philippine journalist Maria Ressa, CEO of the online news site Rappler and frequent critic of the president of the Philippines. She was indicted by the Filipino government. And the staff of the Capital Gazette. The Maryland newspaper lost 5 of its journalists when a gunman opened fire inside its newsroom.
One of the big themes we've seen this year is questions about truth and a surge in misinformation, and we want to highlight the role that journalists play in providing facts, which we think of as the basis of civil discourse. We call this group the Guardians because what they're guarding is truth, liberty, democracy, and freedom, and they were up against a lot of trends this year.
This is the first year the magazine has picked someone who is not alive. Past honorees have included last year's silence breakers from the Me Too movement, President Donald Trump, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and former President Barack Obama. Previous choices have almost stopped time, making us pause and reflect on why the honoree is especially significant today, before they become a part of history.
I think we are trying to make a statement insofar as we're trying to draw attention to the importance of a free press and the pressure that journalists operate under today. Time is, of course, part of that process.
Ariel Hickson, I24NEWS.
Good choice to go with the journalists or a group of journalists, but if it wasn't them, who should it be?
Brett Kavanaugh.
I think I agree, because that was the big political fight this year.
And he's been through so much this year.
You don't have to like him, but it's still a big story. That does it for the South Crossroads. Stay with us on I24 News. Much more ahead.